Most cars are designed to fit in, to follow a plan, a system, a set of rules that keep everything predictable. But every once in a while, something slips through, something louder, bolder, a little harder to justify. The Pontiac GTO Judge was one of those cars. It didn't feel controlled. It didn't feel approved. It felt like a risk. And that's what makes it so interesting, because this didn't come from a small company taking chances. It came from General Motors, a system built on structure, hierarchy, and careful decisions. So how does something like this get made? Was it intentional, or did something inside the system break? They say that in the late 1960s, the tallest building in Detroit wasn't made of steel and glass. It was made of ego. At the very top of the General Motors building, on the legendary 14th floor, sat the men who owned the world. They were the masters of the Sloan system, a hierarchy so rigid, so calculated, that it could predict what kind of car you'd be driving 20 years before you even bought it. It was a world of pinstriped suits, heavy oak desks, and a singular, unwavering belief that the corporation knew what was best for the American public. But deep in the basement of that system, there was a leak. A group of engineers and dreamers at Pontiac were tired of playing by the rules of the 14th floor. They were tired of refinement. They were tired of dignity. They wanted to build something that felt like a punch to the jaw. They wanted to build a car that, by all corporate logic, shouldn't have existed. And for a brief, chaotic moment, they got away with it. This is the story of the Pontiac GTO Judge. It is the story of a corporate mutiny wrapped in carousel red paint. It's the story of the car that GM didn't want you to see, and the car that eventually proved that even the most powerful empire in the world couldn't stop the wheels of change. But to understand the Judge, we have to understand the silence that came before the scream. How does a car get made when it feels like it wasn't supposed to? To find the answer, we have to go back to 1967. General Motors was at the absolute peak of its powers. They were the gold standard of global industry. If you worked for GM, you were part of the establishment. You followed the GM way. The rules were simple. No racing, no engines larger than 400 cubic inches in mid-size cars, no aggressive advertising that promoted speed or street racing. The bosses wanted the public to see GM as a responsible, mature guardian of the American road. They were selling a dream of stability, but at Pontiac, things were different. Pontiac was the excitement division, but by the late 60s, they were starting to look a little too much like their older brother, Oldsmobile. The original GTO, the car that essentially started the muscle car revolution in '64, was growing up. It was getting heavier. It was getting more expensive. It was becoming a gentleman's muscle car, something for the man who had a mortgage and a career. And while Pontiac was moving upmarket, the kids on the street were moving in a different direction. Over at Chrysler, they had just released the Plymouth Roadrunner. It was a stripped-down, bare-bones brawler. It had a bench seat, no hubcaps, and a cartoon bird on the side. It was cheap, it was fast, and it was selling like crazy. The youth of America didn't want a gentleman's car. They wanted something that felt like a rebellion. Pontiac was losing the street. The very people who made the GTO a legend were starting to look elsewhere. And this is the part people don't always see. In a corporation that large, losing the youth market isn't just a sales problem. It's an identity crisis. John DeLorean, the head of Pontiac at the time, saw this. Now, DeLorean wasn't your typical GM executive. He wore his hair long. He unbuttoned his shirt. He hung out with movie stars and socialites. He was a rock star in a world of accountants, and he knew that if Pontiac didn't do something radical, they were going to become irrelevant. He called his team together with a simple mission. We need a Roadrunner killer. We need a car that is cheap, fast, and impossible to ignore. They called the project the ET. It stood for Economic Transportation. The original idea was almost boring. A stripped-out GTO with a smaller engine, maybe a 350, aimed at the budget-conscious buyer. But as the engineers started working on it, something happened. The rebellious spirit of the division started to leak into the design. They realized that if they were going to fight the Roadrunner, they couldn't just be cheaper. They had to be louder. The economic transportation car started to grow a wing. It started to grow hood scoops. It started to develop a personality that was anything but economic. And then there was the name, DeLorean was a fan of pop culture. He watched Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, the biggest show on television. There was a recurring sketch featuring Sammy Davis Jr. and Flip Wilson, where they would strut across the stage in judicial robes, shouting, "Here come to judge." It was irreverent. It was funny. It was slightly subversive. It was exactly what the corporate suits at GM hated. DeLorean decided that would be the name, the Judge. When he brought the idea to the corporate offices, the silence was deafening. The executives hated it. They thought it was undignified. They thought it was a joke. A car named after a comedy sketch, with a giant wing on the back, in a color that looked like a neon warning sign. They told him no. But DeLorean and his team had a way of hearing no as try harder. The internal tension within GM was reaching a breaking point. On one side, you had the stylists and the marketing gurus who wanted to embrace the counterculture. They saw the money being made in the youth market. On the other side, you had the old guard, the men who remembered the Great Depression and the war, who felt that a car should be a symbol of stability, not a symbol of rebellion. But Pontiac had a secret weapon. The engineering was too good to ignore. The Judge wasn't just a styling package. It featured the Ram Air 3 engine as standard. It had a Hurst T-handle shifter. It had a suspension tune for the drag strip. It was a serious performance machine masquerading as a cartoon. The marketing department began to work in the shadows. They didn't sell it as a safe choice. They sold it as a happening. They used psychedelic fonts. They used rock and roll imagery. They built a world around the car before the bosses could even approve the budget. At the time, it probably didn't feel like a risk to them. It felt like war, and in war, you don't ask for permission to win. Before we dive into the moment the world finally saw this machine, I want to take a second to thank you for being here. We love telling these stories of the rebels and the machines they built. If you're enjoying this journey through automotive history, it would mean a lot if you could hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep these stories alive. And there are so many more to tell. The Judge was officially introduced in early 1969, and it was a total shock to the system. It was draped in carousel red. Now, GM officially called it red, but anyone with eyes could see it was orange, a bright, screaming fluorescent orange. It featured a blacked-out grille, functional hood scoops that opened and closed with a vacuum switch, and those iconic "The Judge" decals on the fenders in a font that looked like it was ripped from a Haight-Ashbury poster. It looked like it was breaking the speed limit while it was standing still. And the public reaction? It was polarizing. The older generation, the traditional GTO buyers, looked at it and saw a toy. They saw something that lacked class. They didn't understand why a grown man would want to drive a car with a name from a TV show and a wing on the trunk that served almost no aerodynamic purpose at legal speeds. But the kids saw a car that finally spoke their language. In 1969, the world was on fire. The Vietnam War was raging. The moon landing was months away. Music was getting heavier. The culture was shifting from the polite 1950s into the raw, unfiltered 1970s. The Judge was the perfect avatar for that transition. It was a factory custom. It took the DIY spirit of the street racers and put a warranty on it. It was Pontiac's way of saying, "We're with you. We aren't them." Driving a Judge in 1969 was an act of defiance. When you pulled up to a stoplight, you weren't just driving a Pontiac. You were carrying a flag. You were signaling to everyone within earshot that you didn't care about the corporate rules or the Sloan system. But the conflict didn't stop at the showroom. Perhaps the most famous example of the tension between Pontiac and the GM head office was the Humbler commercial. In 1970, Pontiac produced a Super Bowl ad for the GTO. It featured a young man driving a GTO with a special option called VOE, vacuum-operated exhaust. With the pull of a lever under the dash, the driver could bypass the mufflers, making the car significantly louder and more powerful. The ad showed the driver pulling into a drive-in, pulling the lever, and the deep, aggressive rumble of the engine silencing everyone else. The tagline? The Humbler. The GM executives saw the ad and went into a tailspin. They were terrified. To them, the Humbler represented everything they were trying to hide. It was loud. It was aggressive. It was antisocial. They ordered the ad pulled after only one airing. They ordered the VOE option to be deleted from production. They tried to scrub it from history. And this is the part people don't always see. Even when the car was a success, the company was trying to kill its spirit. By 1970, the GTO Judge had reached its final, most powerful form. They finally broke the corporate 400 cubic inch rule and dropped the massive 455 cubic inch V8 into it. It was a torque monster. It was arguably the peak of the Pontiac muscle era. But even as the cars got faster, the shadows were growing longer. The first blow didn't come from a competitor. It came from the insurance offices. The insurance companies had finally figured out that high horsepower cars and young drivers were a recipe for massive payouts. They began to implement surcharges. In some cases, the insurance premium for a year was nearly half the cost of the car itself. Then came the government. The public was becoming more aware of smog and air quality. The first Clean Air Act was being drafted. General Motors, sensing the coming storm, issued a corporate mandate. All engines must be able to run on low-lead or unleaded gasoline by 1971. This meant lowering compression, and lowering compression meant losing power. The 1971 Judge was a shadow of the 1969 model. The compression was dropped from 10.2, 5-1 to 8.4 to 1. The screamer was being silenced. And then, there was the culture itself. The psychedelic era was fading. The optimism of the 60s was being replaced by the cynicism of the 70s. The bright colors and cartoon decals of the Judge started to look dated. They started to look like remnants of a party that had gone on a little too long. Inside GM, the 14th floor was finally getting their revenge. They used the changing regulations and the rising insurance costs as an excuse to rein in the rebels. They began to phase out the performance options. They began to talk more about efficiency and luxury. The Judge was becoming an embarrassment to the new corporate image. In mid-1971, the order was given. The Judge package was canceled. No fanfare, no farewell tour. It was just gone. The GTO itself would limp on for a few more years, eventually becoming an options package on the smaller Ventura, a car that shared more DNA with a Chevy Nova than the street brawlers of the past. And just like that, something that once stood out started to fade. Looking back, the decline of the Judge feels like the decline of an era. It wasn't just that a car model was discontinued. It was that the spirit of the unauthorized project was being crushed. The corporate walls were being reinforced. The accountants had finally figured out how to lock the basement doors. John DeLorean would eventually leave GM to start his own company. A journey that would end in its own kind of spectacular, tragic chaos. But the GTO Judge remained his greatest statement within the system. It was the proof that you could, for a moment, make the giant blink. So, we come back to the beginning. Was the Pontiac GTO Judge truly something GM didn't want? Or was it exactly what the brand needed at the time? If you look at the ledger books, the Judge was a blip. It only represented a fraction of total GTO sales. It was a logistical headache. It was a target for regulators. From a cold corporate standpoint, it was a mistake. But if you look at the soul of the American road, the Judge was everything. It was the car that reminded people that driving could be more than just transportation. It was a car that gave a generation a way to express their frustration with a standardized world. It was a car that was built with a wink and a nudge by people who loved the machine more than the meeting. Today, when you see a carousel red Judge at a car show, it still stops people in their tracks. It still looks like it's breaking the rules. It still looks like it's hiding a secret. And maybe that's because it is. It's a secret that tells us that the best things, the most memorable things, usually happen when the people in charge aren't looking. It tells us that greatness rarely comes from a committee. It comes from the basement. It comes from the rebels. General Motors might not have wanted you to see the Judge, but the world is a lot more colorful because we did. At the time, it probably didn't feel like a risk. It felt like survival. But looking back now, it almost feels inevitable. If you enjoyed this story, if you feel that pulse of the V8 and the spirit of the street, make sure you subscribe. There are thousands of stories hidden in the chrome and the rust of history, and we're just getting started. There's a lot more to uncover.